good afternoon. Oh, yes, let's record this. Um, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about this panel with these three great scholars who are here to talk about war and conflict, as the title of the panel suggests, but also resistance, collective action, and hopefully peace. I will introduce you to the panelists and then give each of them a chance to tell you more about themselves and their great work. And I'm going to start with Laura Acosta Gonzalez, who is a postdoctoral researcher in international and public affairs at the Watson Institute at Brown University. Laura earned her PhD in sociology from Northwestern, and she's also the winner of the ASA section on Peace, War, and Social Conflicts Outstanding Published Article Award in 2023. The article is War, Commemoration, and Nationalism in Belgium, 1914 to 1945, so you should all check that out. Next, we have Benjamin Case. Ben is a postdoctoral research scholar at Arizona State University's Center for Work and Democracy, and he's an affiliate with the Resistance Studies Initiative at UMass Amherst. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh, and he's the author of Street Rebellion, Resistance, Beyond Violence and Nonviolence, and I believe much more recently, The Anarchist Turn in 21st Century Left-Wing Activism. And then we have Dana Moss, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at University of Notre Dame, go Irish, and an affiliate of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Dana earned her PhD in sociology from UC Irvine, and she's the author of The Arab Spring Abroad, Diaspora Activism Against Authoritarian Regimes. And coming out, I think, very soon, in April, is Transnational Repression in the Age of Globalization. So we are so lucky to have all three of you here. For your own introductions, I think we're going to go in the same order. So Laura, would you like to start and tell us a little bit more about you and your work?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and the other organizers of this panel for the invitation. I am going to share a few slides with you. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. Yes, so thank you so much for that introduction. I am going to be talking today about my research on perpetual civil wars. So it's not particularly about Belgium, but it's about my most recent research and articles that I'm working at the minute. But let's get it started. First, I want to start by giving you a sense of the dimension of the issue of civil war perpetuation across the globe. So this is a figure from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and it shows the geographical location of all 55 active state-based conflicts in 2022. So the majority of these conflicts here, and when I talk about the majority, is nearly 90% of all these conflicts, are intrastate conflicts, or what we commonly know as civil wars. Right? So for those of you who are not familiar with the term or want to learn a little bit about civil wars, this is typically what we know as armed conflict that happens within the territory of an internationally recognized state, and the government is the principal combatant. Now, the insurgent organization that challenges the legitimacy of the incumbent government must be locally represented and must be able to credibly challenge the legitimacy of the incumbent government, right? So those are kind of like the two conditions that we're thinking about. Now, something or one of the most significant features of the civil wars is that they're very, very long conflicts, right? In fact, we're talking that some of the civil wars last for more than 5 consecutive decades. And in fact, since 1946, the duration of civil wars has tripled, and 50% of all post-conflict states relapse into civil war. Now, what you're seeing here in this figure is that is precisely the difference between the number of new civil wars each year, which is the dashed line at the bottom, and the number of ongoing civil wars, which is the solid line in this figure, right? So after 1946, what we see is kind of like an increase in that gap between the number of new civil wars and ongoing civil wars. What this is showing us is that there kind of like this sharp change in the trend in the duration of civil wars. Now, I am not the first sociologist to have noticed this pattern. Others, like Andreas Wimmer and Ann Hironaka, have written extensively about this, and they have focused mostly on explaining the change in this trend since 1946. Now, there's a lot of research in political science and in psychology as well that has made really important contributions to understanding the causes, or pretty much to understanding why civil wars last for so long, right? So I am happy to speak more about these different explanations in the Q&A. Now, talking about my research. My research is generally motivated by this issue. And by this point, I hope I convinced you that it is a very important issue, at least in my perspective. And I have addressed the perpetuation of civil wars, asking many different questions, such as how does the sustained exposure to violence affect people's preferences for conflict resolution? I have also worked on a project in Belgium where we were asking about how the experience of war brings nations together or breaks them apart. More recently, I'm working on projects that ask why do some countries, but not all, fall into cycles of perpetual civil war. In another co-authored project, we're looking into the effects of war making and peacemaking over sustained periods of time and how these then can help us understand some of the mechanisms that sustain civil wars in the long term. And I am also working on a recent project in understanding what is the effect of civil wars on intergroup divisions. So basically, if that cleavage or if that division that originated the civil war in the first place is the same one or changes throughout the ongoing conflict by the end of it. So how our society is divided across groups. Now, I want to talk or discuss kind of like a theme that I have noticed across my research. And I have noticed, or I have found different instances of a mismatch between how actors are represented and portrayed in the media and their actual identities, existence, and actions on the battlefield. And I mean existence because sometimes actors get the term that people use is scapegoating, right? Sometimes bystanders get dragged into the eye of the political storm without even actually playing a role in the battlefield. So this is the level of incongruencies that I'm going to be talking about. Now, why does this happen, or why do I keep finding these incongruencies? Well, we know as sociologists that amid public uncertainty and anxiety, people are constantly trying to make sense of the ongoing violence, right? People are really actively seeking for explanation. So they want to know who did what to whom and why, and who they can trust, who is a friend and who is a foe. Now, additionally, we also know that in conflict, the misrepresentation of reality is a common discursive strategy to shape people's opinion and gain their support. But also this serves as a strategy to delegitimize the opponent. So it's not uncommon to find that, some actors get scapegoated or the enemy gets disproportionately blamed for the violence. So why do I think that this matters for understanding civil war perpetuation or the duration of civil war? Well, I have found that they matter because people base their opinions on how the conflict should end on who they think are the true victims of a conflict, right? I can more talk about these findings in the Q&A, but very briefly, I found that people whose subjective experience of violence does not align with their subjective understanding of victimhood, they tend to base their preferences for conflict resolution more on their feelings about in-groups and out-groups than on the likelihood that these policies are going to make their lives better. And when I talk about this incongruence or this disassociation, I am talking of the groups that are off the diagonal here. So the groups of people who think that they're victims of the conflict, but didn't actually experience objective victimization. And the same happens for those who were actually victims, but don't see themselves as victims. Now, I want to show you another example from my most recent research. In a different project, I also found that who gets blamed for the violence matters for the reoccurrence of conflict. And I mean this not in the traditional way in which we're kind of like used to thinking about conflict, in the sense that violence makes antagonisms and divisions between enemy groups harder or stronger, right? But in the sense that sometimes actors that are not even on the battlefield get blamed for violence that they're not committing. So what is happening here is that they're introduced in the public, in the imaginary of the public, as an imagined enemy, or what I called an imagined third in this case. And this, as I show in my recent research, and I can talk more about this, it can unleash almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Preemptive violence against this imagined third can then cause rebel groups to organize under the banner of that imagined third, and then kind of like completely reshape antagonisms in the country and restart conflict in the long term. So basically, this figure here is kind of like supposed to show us that even though we would expect that most actors in conflict will fall along this diagonal, meaning that the perpetrators of violence would also proportionally get blamed in political discourse or criticized in political discourse for violence, we can find that some actors are disproportionately blamed for violence that they actually didn't commit. Now, in conclusion, there's a few things that I think my research kind of like show us that are new about the duration of civil wars. Primarily, that incongruences between discourse and reality matter, not only because they're not true depictions of reality, but mostly because they can limit or enable the possibilities for conflict resolution in very significant ways. They can affect the way in which individuals come to understand themselves and their opinions about others in relationship to the war, whether they're perpetrators or victims. It also shapes citizens and armed actors' preferences for conflict resolution. And very importantly, we have to think that local and international actors' escalation or de-escalation of conflict and their responses to perceived or imagined threats or actual threats can also be driven by these incongruences with what happens in discourse and in reality. And that's a little bit of my research. Thank you very much for listening. Stop sharing.
That was awesome. Thank you. Next up, we'll hear from Ben.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, for organizing this, and to my co-panelists. I'm excited to be here with you all and really looking forward to a good discussion. So I'm a political sociologist, and I come to my scholarship from the applied perspective of someone who spent more than 2 decades in labor, political, and community organizing. And I stay embedded in and committed to multiple social movement struggles. And that's really the that's really my like orientation and my fuel in doing these kinds of research. So I actually have several different areas of recent work similar to Laura that I think are pertinent here. So I'm going to briefly introduce each and then kind of share some data from one of them by way of a transition to the discussion. So my first book, as Jennifer kindly mentioned in the introduction, is called Street Rebellion: Resistance Beyond Violence and Nonviolence. It was published in 2022 by AK Press. And this is a mixed method study of riots and rioters. It came out of my doctoral studies. So I challenge the binary language of violence and nonviolence that often get imposed on protests and social movements as really hurting more than it helps in terms of us understanding what's going on in these moments. There was at least a time where the field of nonviolent studies was very influential in movements on the ground, in this understanding of nonviolent protest being definable and being categorically more effective. And in fact, what I show is that most uprisings around the world involve a mix of more and less physically confrontational actions that really defy this hard binary of violence and nonviolence. And looking into those gray areas is, in fact, not just productive, but actually essential to understanding movement uprisings in our time. So I look at a lot of data. I look at data on riots and nonviolent demonstrations, and I show that in moments of uprising, especially in multiple countries around the world, you see these variables moving together. Right, so there's all these arguments that that riots will demobilize nonviolent actions, and I show how that's actually not the case. In many cases, riots actually have a positive mobilizing effect on nonviolent actions in the year in which the riot happened and the following year as well. I also conduct in-depth interviews with activists in the U.S. and South Africa who participated in riots, and show that the affective experience and symbolic nature of physical resistance, of rioting, is often more important than the material effects and outcomes of those actions. That embodied sensation of physically fighting back against overwhelming systems of control is really important to people, and has potentially really important long-term impacts. So this short book from the Cambridge Elements series in Contentious Politics just came out a week or two ago, The Anarchist Turn in 21st Century Left-Wing Activism. It's actually free on the Cambridge Elements site, I think through April 4th. So if you're interested, you should download it and check it out. This is a collaborative project with John Markoff, Hilary Lazar, and Danny Burridge. And this is a mixed method study also, looking at the rise in anarchist ideas and methods in movements on the political left in the 21st century. So across the world, we see increased dissatisfaction with liberal democracy in theory and in practice. We draw from multiple other studies to show that. We also see on the political left a move away from traditional state socialist alternatives, away from centralized planning and hierarchical party leadership. And instead, we see increased use of practices associated with the anarchist canon, such as decentralization, horizontalism, mutual aid, direct action, prefiguration, and so forth. And we argue that anarchist theory can be more productively brought into sociological analyses of social movements and civil conflict. So my current research for my day job, if you want, at the Center for Work and Democracy, which is a labor-funded research center at Arizona State University. This research is on ballot initiatives. It's another mixed methods study. I'm very fond of mixed methods. A study of the effect of ballot initiatives as movements have turned to direct votes to try to pass policies that they were unable to get through the Democratic Party or through the representative electoral system. And the top line here is that people vote a lot differently when you ask them to decide on policies than when you ask them to decide on politicians and parties. And this is something we see across red and blue states. So specifically, socially egalitarian and economically redistributive measures are overwhelmingly popular in red and blue states. So which sort of contravenes this notion of like a country that's polarized down the middle, and it's red and blue along party lines, everyone hates each other. Of course, there's like truth to that in some ways, but votes on things like taxing the wealthy to fund public schools or raising the minimum wage or expanding access to affordable healthcare show that actually supermajorities in red and blue states tend to support these kinds of measures. And likewise, we also show that, oh, by the way, the image I'm showing is a public report that we put out in 2022, I should have mentioned. So that's free on the Center for Work and Democracy website. And the book from this research is now under contract with Verso. I'm working on that now. So just like we see egalitarian policies and redistributive policies being widely popular in red and blue states, we also see anti-democratic pushback to ballot initiatives coming from both Republicans and Democrats. We hear a lot in the media about anti-ballot initiative reactions happening from Republicans to try to stop ballot initiatives, for example, to pass reproductive freedom. So that, of course, is something we see. But we also see almost identical anti-democratic pushback to ballot initiatives in Democrat-controlled municipalities like Atlanta and Washington, D.C., where movements are using ballot initiatives to try to pass policies that would challenge profit and power in those places. And so this work is meant to, on the one hand, discuss movement strategy and sort of hybridizing a more direct action approach and a more electoral approach, drawing from a kind of non-reformist reform theory, and also to highlight the oligarchic nature of the US political system in many instances. Okay, so by way of transition, I want to share a few graphs that come from the Street Rebellion book, the riots book. I have data on riots and nonviolent demonstrations from the Cross-National Time Series Data Archive. And I look at this for 10 different countries in different regions. They're organized alphabetically. This is the first, it's Brazil, from just after World War II until 2020. And the purpose of these, I have 10 different countries that I chose for their geographic distribution and for the different regions for the country that I felt would have the best chance at having accurate data in the data set. And so the purpose in the book was to show that riots and nonviolent demonstrations tend to occur together, especially when there's major shocks to one. You almost always see a shock to the other. And this was meant to flesh out the quantitative analyses of this data that I show. But in this case, for the purposes of this conversation, I actually want to draw your attention to the right end of the graph, the part that depicts riots and nonviolent demonstrations in the past decade for all of these different countries. Okay, so this is Brazil, China, Ethiopia, France, Iran. And by the way, this data stops in 2020, so many of these countries have even more major uprisings since then, like Iran, for example, that are not here. Mexico, Philippines, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And you'll notice that for all of these, there's significant spikes, often the largest in all of this data, but one way or another, significant spikes in the last decade, and not single spikes, but almost always multiple spikes in succession, increasingly rapidly. So we're seeing this across the world. And this is the US, by the way. This is only until 2019. And I showed it that way in order so that readers could see the variation over time. When you add the data from the George Floyd uprising in 2020, this is what the US looks like. So that uprising is so massive that it essentially flatlines the rest of the data. And so by way of transition, I just want to point out the fact that none of the contradictions, none of the sparks that gave rise to many of these uprisings, including in the US. In the US, for example, we'd say the global justice movement, Occupy, climate justice, movements for Black Lives, and George Floyd uprising, but also the uprisings that have happened around the world in recent decades. These uprisings have been put down or abated, but basically none of them have been resolved in terms of their core issues that sparked these, or even mitigated. In fact, many of the sparking events and issues have been exacerbated. So I'll leave it there for now and look forward to the discussion. Yeah, stop sharing my screen here. There we go.
Thank you, Ben. Dana, you are next.
Great, thank you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen as well. And I just want to say while I'm figuring this out that I am so stoked to be here with Laura and Ben. I am such big fans of their work, and they do such great writing. So if you haven't read their stuff already, please do that. And it's great to see you again, Jennifer, and I'll see all the great things that you're doing as well. So yeah, I wanted to just put up kind of a little advert here, since my book is free, and I think free is the best price. But let me just trace a little bit about like where I'm coming from and where I'm going. Since we're doing this quickly, I've always been really interested in how people achieve social change and particularly how they resist authoritarian types of top-down coercive control in ways that create a lot of, that kind of control creating a lot of human suffering. I've always been really interested in that, and I think it's been part of my, personality, the kind of person who gets in trouble, kind of, is sort of interested in rebellion naturally. And coming at this from a theoretical perspective, I thought, the study of social movements is such a great home to study processes of social change. Of course, not all social change comes directly from social movements, but I became interested in what a lot of scholars call the repression dissent nexus, which is, when does government repression succeed in controlling and neutralizing dissent in some way, at least for a certain period of time? And when does it actually stoke protests? And then sort of at the end of that, like, when do people sometimes get what they want at the end of all these protests and riots, like, Ben was talking about. So a couple of studies have really shaped my thinking on these matters. I've done field work in Jordan, where I talked to activists who ranged from sort of, striking labor workers all the way to NGO human rights folks. And it brought my attention to the fact that repression often looks really different depending on our perspective and people's experiences, and that the existing literature had not done a very good job of accounting for things other than arrests or those types of quantifiable data that are oftentimes more public and easy to access. So I learned a lot more about the different kinds of sort of soft, quote unquote, and hard power that are used against activists by authoritarian regimes, but also why authoritarian regimes are paradoxically sort of not always willing to use hard repressive force to quell people. So how do people leverage that in order to push for their rights, I think, is a really important question. Freedom House, I think, just put out that we're in like the 18th straight year of democratic decline in the world. So these questions about when people power can actually be harnessed for change are really occupying me right now. Another study that I ended up doing for my dissertation and then became the book that's sort of pictured back here, and I can like stop sharing the screen. I'm not focused enough to be able to like handle that kind of coordination right now. So then the next thing I did was study how the Arab Spring revolutions that were popping off in 2011, you all are probably old enough to remember, my students were like legitimately playing Pokemon in 2011. So they don't remember. So in any case, this was a wave of revolutions that spread across places like Tunisia and Egypt and Yemen, etc. I had been a peace activist in some capacity for Yemen in the past. I know that's kind of random. That's another story. But I was really interested in what was going on in some of these authoritarian states that hadn't been extensively studied. Turkey and Egypt have been extensively studied, but not so much, particularly in sociology in places like Syria, Yemen, or Libya. When these revolutions were happening, though, simultaneously, like I couldn't get the visas I needed to go where I needed to go to interview like revolutionaries on the ground. And sometimes it wasn't safe to do things like that. So I ended up studying what was happening outside, because right in almost literally in my backyard at the time, I was a, PhD student in California, you had diaspora communities, first and second generation immigrant communities from some of these states coming out to protest for freedom and democracy in their home countries, fundraising for their home countries, and sometimes even going back home to fight in these conflicts, even if their families had been in exile for a generation. So I became fascinated in this dimension of the revolutions, and it ended up being a neat thing to study because turns out we haven't really done enough to theorize how revolutions are actually transnational phenomena. They pull in a lot of different actors, as Laura knows from her research on civil wars too. It's like, civil wars just attract all sorts of superpowers, geopolitical powers who get involved, right? Who are trying to like sway the outcome to their expectation or their ideal. And so the roles that diasporas have to play sort of in this boomerang effect that Keck and Sitkink talk about, which is like what's going on in the home country in these authoritarian repressive contexts where people really need help in order to win these revolutions. And in the policy centers in places like London or DC, diasporas often form brokers between those. And they aren't going to determine the outcome of conflicts, but they can save lives on the ground. They can certainly influence policy when they're invited to do so. And a lot of them experienced a real kind of political awakening from the Arab Spring because they felt newly empowered to come out. So the last part of that research trajectory, which links into that, is my research on state-led transnationalism. So I've kind of gone from what's going on between activists and agents in the state, what's going on across them. And now I'm interested in how states are trying to fight back against diaspora activists and other kinds of transnational actors who are trying to name and shame them and undermine their legitimacy and support rebel groups at home. In that case, I found that what's been going on with a lot of these communities I've studied for a long time is that authoritarian regimes would send agents and use all kinds of methods to spy on diaspora communities, try to control the sort of political activities they were doing, and essentially replicate certain types of authoritarian repression within these communities. Right now, this is happening and targeting Chinese communities, Uyghur communities, Tibetan communities. This is an active thing that is actually growing. So I was able, through some of my work on transnational repression, which is again showing how these home country regimes deploy different tools abroad to try to crush dissent in diaspora and immigrant communities. I've joined with some other scholars who are in political science, yay, our friends in political science, who are very, very interested in transnational repression because states are more easily able to locate activists abroad these days because everybody carries around a tracking device and a supercomputer social media machine in their pocket. And unfortunately, we see that transnational repression acts as egregious as the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey, renditions, kidnappings, all kinds of awful human rights abuses. They're actually on the rise right now because, again, this is happening in a global context where authoritarian regimes aren't just operating with more and more impunity, but they're collaborating with both like populist authoritarian type leaders like our former president Donald Trump. I don't mind saying that on the record. I don't think that's that controversial. And and anyway, so the point is there are a lot of collaborations happening between different types of actors to actually penalize these groups abroad and keep them quiet. So the literal ground in which people have as a place of sanctuary and refuge where they can express their civil liberties and their political freedoms and rights is actually shrinking. So what that's been making me think of, and this is the last thing, is how a lot of folks who are very important human rights activists, Nobel Prize winners, but also people who just are like ordinary people doing kind of volunteer type work, they are really residing in this intersection of the kinds of discrimination, racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia that comes from settling in a place like the United States. And they're also facing pressures from having ties to their home country. If they've got family, if they've got assets, if they've got any tie that they want to retain to the home country, they have to worry about what they say and do because they might get on a blacklist or, what's happening with Saudi Arabian activists now in the United States and Canada is their entire families are being thrown into prison because they dare to say something about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from like Toronto, right? These regimes are so sensitive about censorship and their image right now. It's putting a lot of pressure on these activists. So that's some of the work that I've been really privileged to do because I feel like there's more policy attention to this now, and we're able to push for better refugee protections. ICE, unfortunately, can, for example, arrest and deport someone who's a registered asylum seeker on the basis of what's called a red notice. A red notice is something that Interpol, the International Criminal Agency, which is not a police agency, it has no arresting authority, it just exchanges warrants between states to be like, hey, there's a red notice, this terrorist might be trying to like get into your country, right? Like if you find him, arrest him. Well, unfortunately, these red notices are politicized, right? Syria can issue red notices against human rights activists abroad. This happens all the time. Turkey, Russia, it's just happening all the time. So unfortunately, repressive agencies like ICE will potentially detain and deport someone on the basis of a red notice issued through Interpol, which is actually in violation of federal law in the United States, but happens anyway because it's not being coordinated. So I'm thinking a lot about how like repressions, different forms of repressions are intersecting for different groups. and making even some groups who have fair amount of privilege in terms of their education or their wealth, they're still being targeted, right? They're being targeted in part because they have some kind of social capital. So that's what I'm thinking about. And I'm just like really happy to be with you all. And it's fun to do these things. Like, this is how we go to school, you know, as we like learn about each other's work and all the cool things we haven't had time to read. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Before we jump into questions, I actually wanted to give you all a chance to comment on each other's work, or, you know, comment on any connections or differences that you see. So I will open the floor to the three of you to do that. Yeah.
You could put us on the spot.
Yeah.
So
I didn't have an order in mind either, and I just this moment realized like I might have given you an order, but Dana,
I have a
you are
question.
unmuted, so.
I have a question. Okay. I love both your work so much. Ben, I am dying to know what has been the reception to your critique of the sort of like, you know, glossy nonviolence literature. Because that was something we talked a lot about when I was in Pittsburgh. And I think you did such a beautiful and effective job. So congratulations to both of you on your awards as well. Like, you did such a beautiful job, I think, of showing that it's a lot more complicated than we've assumed in the past. But yeah, what's been the response? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Dana. And also, yeah, thanks for your help on the project in general. You'll find Dana's name in the thank yous in the acknowledgement section. You know, for activists, I mean, it was really meant for an activist audience. That's why I chose to publish with AK Press. And for the audience that I wanted to read this, it's been great. So I'm really gratified for that. I've given a number of talks to activist groups and gotten some really thoughtful feedback, generally really positive, but overall really productive and generative, and that started some good conversations. I'm really happy about that. And through that, I've been able to also help some other folks with kind of activist-oriented studies around these types of topics, which was my hope. So I'm very happy about that. I also did hope, if I'm being honest, that it would pick some fights, because I think those could have been productive here. And again, the reason I got into this research in the first place was because as an activist, as an organizer, I saw this really heavy-handed effect that some of the nonviolence research had on the ground that wasn't always great. And I wanted to complicate that. I wanted to have that discussion. I wanted to have that debate. And I've not been able to do that, I'll say, overall. So I've really had basically silence from that crowd. So that's unfortunate, although not entirely. I will say that there's been a number of folks who've reached out and who've asked me to review their work, and so there has, to some extent, there has been some stuff there, but not to the level that I would have hoped for in my wildest dreams. But yeah, we'll see.
I think it's partly because you argued it so effectively, but I'll shut up now. Thanks, Ben.
Oh, no,
That's
I mean,
great.
I appreciate that. That's kind of you, but I also think, I guess I'll also just take the moment to say, I think the moment has shifted also. I think when I wrote it, I mean, it takes a long time to do this research and write a book. And at the time that I was doing it, this was a really fiery debate in movements. And also for a lot of scholars, it was starting to become that. But there was this real dominant theory about, you know, the effect of nonviolent protests, you know, coming from like the Erica Chenoweths and Maria Stephans and those sorts of folks. And that entire, like, that argument has gotten pretty quiet in the past few years. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. And I think like some of them are located in Ukraine. I think, you know, there was always a some level of exchange between some of the glossier, as you put it, some of the glossier nonviolence research and US foreign policy. And so I think that given some of the foreign policy shifts in the past few years, I think maybe the funding situation has changed for those sorts of things. Also, there was a paper that Chenoweth published, I believe in 2022, late 2022, it was just before the book came out, that quietly walked back some of the more bombastic claims that had been made. It got very little press. I think it was in Journal of Peace Research, but I could be wrong about that. And so I think there's been kind of quiet recognition that some of these claims about the superior efficacy of exclusively nonviolent protests were overstated.
Yeah,
I was also going to ask, yeah, you go ahead.
yeah, should I? Yeah, just to answer to Jennifer's question, I feel like I noticed a few commonalities across her work, particularly thinking about Ben's work and kind of like your focus on nonviolent forms of protest. I think that the Civil War literature is heavily sort of like they have thought a lot, put a lot of thought into the organizational and the military capacities of actors, but not so much on kind of like what are the effects precisely for kind of like the longevity of the civil war, so for sustaining civil wars, of everything that happens outside of the battlefield, right? All of these kind of like other non-violent forms of protest, and the role that actors take that is not necessarily just mobilizing, taking up on arms. So I think that in that way, I think that it is also a very productive kind of like line of thinking, and to kind of like draw a bridge from perhaps that research into what's happening in the Civil War literature, I think. I was also thinking about Dana's work, which sounds absolutely fascinating. I want to hear more about that, and actually to share something that I found in my research. Now that I'm thinking about like what was the start of kind of like the communist enemy in Colombia back in the mid 20th century, I see that this sort of like misalignment, or why blame a third that has nothing to do with the original fault line in the conflict, was due to international pressures, and was the meddling and the action, the pressure that was put into local actors for blaming a third, right? So even though we tend to think that this is not consequential, it's so important for kind of like the shape and the long-term development of what happens locally, how even local actors come to understand each other over time, right? So and yet again, this is not just with arms and guns, right? This is kind of like just by making all these claims. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
And I also just I was gonna also ask maybe some open-ended questions of each of you. I really enjoyed revisiting both of your work in preparation for this. Laura, your Theory and Society paper from 2021, the victim dissociation paper, I really love that paper. It's so good, deserving of all the awards and credit that it got. I would love to hear you talk more about, because like yeah, I mean, just like great in all the ways. But in the conclusion, you talk about, in the sections where you get to kind of, spin out your thoughts a little bit aside from just the empirical research, you talk about the US context. Specifically in that case, you're talking about the ways victimhood and survivorship are framed in terms of sexual assault. And I would also love to hear you comment on the ways you might see the effects that you recognize playing out in U.S. politics, in the ways that like the most hot button issues, the one that soak up a lot of media airspace, like whether it's like critical race theory or like, whatever, like the pronouns and trans politics and schools and libraries and like the sorts of things that the right wing uses to mobilize people, for example. I would just love to hear you comment on the ways you see like victim narratives playing into that in the breakdown that you have. Yeah, Dana, so many things that I would love to hear you talk about, but I think specifically in our moment, I think transnational activism is like a big thing right now. And not to get too into it, but I would just love to hear your thoughts on the like transnational networks that have maybe either that have continued since the research you did for your first book, or that have sort of sprung up since then, and the effects those are having on domestic politics, like in the US. Because something that I noticed that is like, it feels as though there's a breaking down of boundaries between national and transnational frames for political mobilizations. And, we see all kinds of different flags and mobilizing orientations happening in protests that are not, based domestically. So I'd love to hear you talk about that. And I have other questions about hard and soft repression, but I'll just stop there.
Should I start? Yeah. Okay, Dana, thanks. Well, thanks so much for these great questions. Yeah, I actually, when you were talking about your project on anti-democratic mobilization, kind of like this democratic backsliding, I was also thinking about kind of like how we have seen kind of like this politics of victimhood being mobilized across the world, really, in the US, even with Brexit, in so many different contexts, right? In the way that I think that peace in theory in society kind of like can illustrate or help us think through these kind of like electoral results that might seem kind of like unexpected or kind of like surprising in certain ways, is kind of like perhaps to think about why sometimes we see what we would think people who have directly been affected by some form of discrimination or violence by being part of a certain group actually even kind of like mobilize against the interest of their own group. That is the part that I found so surprising, particularly in the case of Colombia, right? I mean, we were seeing kind of like direct victims, people who had lost their family members, their son was disappeared. So throughout so many instances, they wouldn't support the peace agreement. And I just couldn't wrap my hand around that, right? I was like, why would you not just put an end to this, right? And this is kind of like where kind of like I could see how they could verbalize very well kind of like all of the arguments put forward by politicians in these very sort of like dichotomous terms of who's really getting the benefit of this policy, who's really getting the benefit of this. And that is not my group. That is exactly the others, right? Those who don't deserve this recognition, those who don't deserve the benefit from the policy. And I think that plays out in the US and in different contexts, perhaps in similar ways, right? What happens with this discourse about victimhood, victimization of the group, is that then it becomes almost kind of like irrational in that term to think that you would vote or support a government policy that would benefit the enemy, for a lack of a better word, right? So I think that in the context of Trump's election, I was constantly wondering, why did he have so much, for instance, support from the Latin diaspora in Florida, right, for getting elected, when he was speaking in such horrible terms about Mexicans and Latinos generally, right? I mean, that seemed kind of like it really didn't make sense to me. Or how would Black and brown politicians endorse his election when he was in his rhetoric, he was speaking, about crime in such terms that seemed really counterintuitive. So I think that victimhood disassociation in that sense help us really to understand when kind of like different understandings of in groups and out groups play a role in politics and when they do not. Yeah, but thanks for that question.
Oh, right. I was just so like, my mind was just so blown with ideas from what Lara just said. Oh, wow. That's awesome. So I'm going to address Ben's question and then hopefully tie it to Laura's if I remember by then. Transnational kind of advocacy, humanitarianism, and mobilization of cash, arms, I mean, anything, you name it, is really central to any of the sort of quote unquote domestic conflicts that we see. So around Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, around Hong Kong, around Ukraine, Turkey. any place that's getting, not only increasingly repressive, but where there are active sort of fight over what people can say and from where, it's very important. The Hong Kong diaspora has even, through intermediaries, reached out to me to talk about strategies like how do you advocate for, something when, the countries you're advocating to are not only oftentimes a case of an enemy of my enemy is my friend, because they perpetuate so much of this top-down racism, right? Like that you have to deal with in the host country, which Laura is saying, like a lot of people are not voting according to that. But in any case, yeah, like how they're like reconciling these things basically. So they're looking for ways to capitalize on, sort of pro-democracy, stability, and all of the anti-China rhetoric here. But that, unfortunately, oftentimes puts really well-intentioned humanitarian peace, otherwise peace activists in the position of advocating for intervention by a country like the United States into their home country. And this is where diasporas get caught between a rock and a hard place, because there's no one else with the capacity to do anything vis-a-vis China's intervention in Hong Kong besides a very powerful international organization or a state like the US. But then that aligns them with a lot of politicians who preach anti-Asian hate at home. So this sort of, I'm trying to figure out, so sort of for a next side project, how to ground this intersection of sort of local power issues and transnational ones in people's, experiences. Obviously, transnational repression is a very clear example of how that manifests, but it doesn't always manifest just in, sort of the state pursuing people across borders. It can manifest in community mistrust. It can manifest in how people build civic organizations, right? Are they doing it sort of along like quote unquote sectarian lines from the home country? Like what's happening? These transformations are really fascinating. But now I'm also interested because I've been thinking about this, right? I'm like, no matter how much diaspora mobilization you have in Belarus or the United States or wherever for Ukraine, that alone will never win that war, right? Like it matters a lot how many resources they can get into Ukraine, but they cannot win that war for Ukraine, right? They can just try to be this auxiliary support. The only thing that's really going to get Russia to stop fighting that war is if it starts impacting them extremely negatively in a domestic way. And we've already seen that the Russian establishment around Putin and in the military is sort of fragmented and divided, and that there have actually been a lot of desertions from the military. So now I'm thinking, if we want to understand conflict, but also how it resolves, we need to understand when militaries fall apart. So right now, my next other project is on how members of the military resisted the war in Vietnam, which was fought by our country 50 years ago. And so I'm interviewing veterans who are a lot of times at this stage of their life in their 70s or so. This is the boomer generation, who are willing to talk about some of these things for the first time, or at least get it off their chest before they pass away. And so I'm hoping that that research will also help us to see how resistance undermines authoritarian control and even violence against people of a foreign, place like Vietnam or Ukraine. But that's very much in progress. There's a ton of really good literature on defection, but like Ben is nuancing, there's not a good literature on all the different ways that people may resist and continue to retain that insider status as military members, right? Like it's happening at the same time. So I'm excited about that because, like, again, thinking about how repression works sort of at different levels and in different ways, our embodied experiences, though, definitely reflect a lot of that. And I'm looking forward to doing more work on that.
This is fantastic. I want to ask, I am worried that I prepared too many questions for the time that we have allotted. So I I'm going to skip around a little bit in my own notes and make sure that we get to some questions that I really want to ask. So first, because this panel series is supposed to be about the 2024 US election, I do want to ask one question that like sort of ties this back into that. Though all of you actually have done like drawn really interesting connections, I think, to like contemporary US politics. But I want to know what you see in like the news in the US, like what do you read in the New York Times or any other news media that like US politicians or political thinkers are getting wrong about the sort of conflicts that you study, um, uh, you know, or like either like cross-national conflicts or like country, intranational conflicts where the US like isn't necessarily a party to it.
I mean, what don't policymakers get wrong about Middle Eastern countries and their relationships and their histories? I would say that one of the big ones is the assumption that alliances are formed along these political religious Islamist lines very simply. And they're not at all. We don't just have sort of Shia versus Sunni in the Middle East, and that's not how a lot of times these alliances are first formed. And in fact, again, to go back to geopolitics and the role of transnational politics, so many of the various political machinations that have happened since the, formal independence from colonialism come as a result of a lot of international meddling in the region, and the alliances that were formed during the Cold War is what I'm trying to say. If anybody ever gets a chance, the edited version is horrible. Do not watch it. But if you can find a 3-part long-form fictional film about Carlos, the left-wing sort of terrorist activist who ended up taking a lot of famous people hostage at an earlier point in time. This shows how leftist movements, and Ben knows way more about this than I do, but how leftist radical movements were really connected all over the world during this time where they were really trying to revolutionize and use violent mobilization against all different kinds of causes and foreign powers and Western imperialism and so forth. And I love thinking about this because it kind of puts the movement back in movements. You know what I mean? Like movements move around. They don't just stay in one place. They look for resources abroad. They look for ties abroad, and it's a lot to keep track of, but it can also tell us a lot about or explain a lot, I think, about what's going on that we can observe. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I like one or two come to mind. Yeah, as Dana said, I mean, there's an endless list, but I think a couple come to mind, and they both revolve around something that I've been thinking a lot about, in the activist world as well, which is the kind of the deterioration of reliance on formal organizations and movements, and much more common, the much heavier reliance on informal networks and those sorts of connections. Because I think when it comes to social movements, media, journalists, and I've dipped my toes in that world enough to know, you're trying to write a story, you need to look for someone to explain it, you need a quote from someone here or there, you look for the organizations, you look for where you can get a contact with somebody. So that's what's going to get reproduced. So then we get this idea like there's these organizations. I mean, most humorously in the past few years, it was like, the anti-fascists, right? Antifa, as the Fox News people like to pronounce it. There's this whole wave of like just horrendous and like actually, I mean, hilarious, depending on how you look at it, analyses about how this is an organization and what it does. And just like anybody who's ever, been to an activist meeting knew that there's no organization called this. There's only loose networks of people who associated themselves as anti-fascists. There have been organizations that were specifically like Antifa organizations, like anti-racist action in the past or ones like that. But for the most part, it's informal groups. And that leads to just all these misunderstandings. I think activists in a lot of cases are totally happy to let pass, totally happy if the media sphere and consequently the authorities often misunderstand what they're doing. But I also think this comes into play in lots of other ways that are much more relevant to elections, where I think the media spheres that are stereotypically, but there's truth to it, that are really based in urban coasts, deeply misunderstand a lot of what's happening in a lot of the country, and they're drawing lessons from electoral maps that don't actually reflect what people are thinking. And I get this a lot from the ballot initiative research, where it's like, you talk to people in South Dakota, which is a solid red state. I mean, they haven't voted a Democrat for president for, like half a century or something like that. It's all red state government. Most people hate the Republicans. You know what I mean? Like, people hate politicians. People don't trust politicians. And if we derive from this like, we're going to map out red and blue based on who votes what in the presidential elections, and therefore we understand what people think because we associate the Democrats with CNN and the Republicans with Fox News. And, there's this kind of like half-baked analysis that comes out of that I still feel like is kind of the norm, which is just deeply wrong about a lot of things. And I think it relates to something similar about assuming that because someone votes one way or another on the day, that they therefore associate with this political party in the sense of like, a political party of a century ago or something like that. Whereas, that's not what the parties are now, and that's not what voting means now for a lot of people in the US.
Yeah, what do politicians in the US media gets wrong about the Colombian Civil War? Again, so many things, but I would say perhaps something that stands out would be the issue that this is a war about drugs, right? That if we fuel a lot of money into fumigating, spreading, chemicals over all these coca leaf plantations, then kind of like this is how we're intervening and this is how the aid should be put into motion. This is exclusively about armed groups still having the means to fight. It also kind of like, and perhaps what gets missed is kind of like what message that sends as well for how people come to understand government intervention and how to end the war, right? And by that I mean how even Colombians come to see people who are fighting this war as criminals, exclusively driven by greed, right? What has been the role in sending this aid in the 1970s to grow to grow the middle class, the Colombian middle class, as a way to kind of like take the country away from the path of potentially expanding communism, right? And what that was also telling people about of communism as an evil that was coming after them, and that it could potentially be the worst thing that could ever happen to Colombians ever. So in a way, aid matters in the way in which kind of like how they send and how they help and come to understand these conflicts in very simplistic terms. Not simplistic, but kind of like a problem of one thing or a division between one group and another. It kind of like really perhaps overlooks, right, the effect that it has in how the local populations come to understand each other and the people who mobilize in these insurgencies. And then that it really has a very strong effect in the possibilities for building bridges and kind of like really bringing this conflict to an end. I would think perhaps that is something, I don't know if they're getting it wrong, but they're certainly kind of like perhaps not thinking about this potential effects. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to use my latitude as moderator here to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I wanted to know if there are any themes that you all have seen in the conflicts that you study, like for instance, antecedents to conflict, or like the role of things like globalization or climate change, or like particular ideologies that like keep coming up in um, conflict, or war, or protest, etc. Either that was like a really loaded question or a really softball question. I can't decide. I'll let you decide.
Can you maybe rephrase it? That might help.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking about is I think all of you to some degree are not just looking at like war or conflict or resistance in like one particular case, but at least two or three, or like multiple cases. And so I'm wondering if you see like, oh, very often, like an antecedent to this conflict is, um, I'm going to say misunderstandings between groups. That feels like the most Pollyanna-ish thing I could have said. But like it's a fight over resources that are scarce because like that's the primary issue in this area. Or, is there a theme that you see like consistently comes up when you are looking at the conflicts that you study?
That's an interesting question. I guess I'm happy to start. And I'm also, because of, I made the mistake, but because I like introduced a number of different areas of my work, now I'm trying to like filter each question into like which one does it make the most sense to base this in. But I guess what comes to mind is, in thinking about studying riots and violent protests, one of the most common themes that comes up in looking at the data and in talking to people is the initial spark of police violence, right? That's not controversial. People generally I think people who like look at these things seriously generally understand that. But not just police violence in the sense of like George Floyd being murdered in public, in broad daylight by a police officer, but also, I mean, to take that example, the third precinct was burned in Minneapolis, which sparked the George Floyd uprising, not directly after George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. Peaceful protests took the streets and police attacked peaceful protesters, and then it escalated into that. So the direct catalyst for a lot of this is police attacking demonstrators. But at a deeper level, when we get into the interviews, and I'm drawing from some, personal experience as well. But when you get into the interviews, I mean, there's this sensation of raw frustration with the compounding crises that people are facing. And you're trying to just say something, and then there's people in armor who are agents of the state who are there to stop you, to shut you up, to hurt you for that. And it can be like these raw reactions of that can like spark in these moments. And I think that there's I think there's something that's worthwhile to pay attention to there as we see riotous protests increase in frequency and ferocity around the world. I think the combination of real, and also this goes to Laudo's research too, like real and perceived victimization by various systems, and then on top of that, agents of the state violently enforcing that is a potent combination for sparking uprising.
Laura, do you want to go next, or?
Yeah, sure. I'll go next. I noticed that in my presentation, I was actually thinking, okay, like what is the common theme? And I think I would say it's perhaps that I have found so puzzling, and it's kind of like this this sort of like this connection between like what we think that a conflict is about and how the people who live the conflict in the small communities, these collected narratives about the conflict, really sometimes don't have nothing to do with it. Like what was kind of like surprising to me was particularly in the case of Colombia in the 1940s, in the 1950s, the war prior to the current war, we think about it, or we memorialize it as a war between liberals and conservatives that were fighting against each other in their communities. They really hated. They wouldn't marry each other. If you were wearing the wrong color and you were in the wrong place, people will attack you. This is kind of like how we come to understand this war. Now, when we read about the civilian accounts of how the war unfolded in these communities, we notice that they had a sensation that it was the government attacking them, right? Regardless of political affiliation, there was this state oppression. And it was this state oppression that then kind of like worsens when the state comes to think that all of these communities are pretty much motivated by international communists who are arriving in the country. And then the violence escalates. It kind of like confirms what they were already thinking, elevates their fear of the repression, and then drives the mobilization. And that's kind of like what I'm seeing in my data, right? But what is interesting about this is that this is perhaps thinking about a very huge scale of an entire civil war. But this is not uncommon, perhaps at a lower scale. And I was really surprised to perhaps see, I don't know if with the attacks in Russia, you saw that Vladimir Putin said that he had grounds, or he would suspect that it was Ukraine who had actually the incentives to attack Russia, despite of, perhaps evidence or the international media speaking about it in different terms, right? Even ISIS claiming that they committed the attack, right? No, he decided to blame someone else, right? So this is really what we're seeing, and it's kind of like behind what we see that is happening on the ground, and the reasons for why blame another, for why steer the discourse into a different direction. I think that in sociology, there's kind of like a lot of productive research that could help us kind of like make a more kind of like direct link between what happens at the micro level and what happens at the civilian level, and what is really happening in political discourse, and kind of like try to systematically think about how one thing influences the other, right? How not just that these are completely separated domains, but there is a point where kind of like what happens on one kind of like reverts and has implications for the other.
Yeah, that's so important for thinking about the role of misinformation in US politics today too. And Laura, what you were just saying really was making me like have flashbacks to what I've been reading about what was happening in Vietnam, in terms of like local level repression basically, and how it impacted mobilization on the ground in the South there. It's really amazing. I think about repression as like basically a strategy of divide and conquer. It's maybe not just that, like I haven't, I'm sort of theorizing on the fly here, okay? And like Ben, I'm very interested in these reactive, spontaneous moments of confrontation, which are often extremely consequential for the way conflict unfolds, both violent and nonviolent, but particularly violent. So I think about the ways in which states are being effective in dividing and conquering people. And like part of it is through narrative and misinformation. And part of it is through actual violence, right? And like Ben talking about these police confrontations with almost and if you kind of like broaden police officer to security agent, like what he said describes almost the beginning of every single confrontation in the Arab Spring that I can think of. So, I mean, this is such a key part, and these intersections between local level, national level, and international forms of repression is really interesting. But I mean, obviously, it's really sad that, there's so much media and there is so much scapegoating going on everywhere that is just an easier story, it seems, for people to buy than the actual structural, more complicated story. And the harder to fix story is that the scapegoating is working to a large capacity. It's just distracting people from the basic plain facts. And this is why you have a lot of political sociologists who know what they're talking about, comparing us to, like sort of pre-Nazi Germany, because we have some, unfortunately, in the Venn diagram of those two things, this is one of the commonalities. And unfortunately, the current conflicts have not partisanized or bifurcated, or made better, more solidarity, I think, around these things. I've only seen like more of that. I think, probably the best we can do as educators is to make people aware that this is happening so that they can at least question when they are at war with themselves or with someone else, right? Like, is this actually true? Is this actually true? And Putin has whatever Putin says has an incredible amount of power. Like, if he says the White Helmets are not a legitimate humanitarian organization in Syria and instead they're Islamic State terrorists, unfortunately, that has real life consequences in Syria. And so too does the election of Donald Trump, both for domestic and foreign policy in the future. And like Ben is saying, I, as a peace activist in the past, really can't stand the current state of the Republican and Democrat politics. But we are making a lot of compromises these days in order to protect some basic collective goods. And unfortunately, I think we're going to be kind of defending the little ground that we've made, because we have made some ground, like we have gained ground in civil rights and human rights, but then the backlash against that is just so enormous. I think that's where we are right now. So I think we're going to continue to see this in waves. And the last thing I'll say about your question, Jennifer, is that the thing that irks me the most is when scholars say the Arab Spring failed. And here's why. We know that the Arab Spring did not create long-standing developed democratic states in any of the places where it occurred, including all of its different iterations and waves, which went on for like over 10 years. However, in many of these cases, including like sort of extreme examples like in Libya and Yemen, people's power and the coalitions that coalesced around those did succeed in usurping presidents and pharaoh type authoritarian dictators who had been in power for 30 and 40 years. The things that happened after that are a consequence of, what was left of the state when these dictators left, and international conflicts and conflicts over resources on the ground, right? That's like phase 2. But we shouldn't expect anything different, because it takes time and some degree of stability to build the kind of ideal outcome that we want to see in these places. So I know activists get discouraged, and I feel like the Arab Spring has now been kind of dismissed as this abstract failure. But I want to say that it was the most impressive embodiment of people power and bravery that I've ever seen in my life. I was watching it sort of 24/7 on Al Jazeera at the time. And that, and that it wasn't for nothing. We're going to be seeing the consequences of that play out over the course of the next generation. And there's going to be another wave at some point. So I think we have to be patient. We have to understand not everything happens on the timeline that we want or expect. And we have to be very, very respectful of activists who sacrificed everything for revolutions that did not go their way. They're still paying the price. So that's all what I'll say about that. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take the last few minutes. If you have questions, I'd love for you to put them in the Q&A. Yeah, I mean, we have a group that maybe we could open it up.
Someone had a hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Oh, all right. We have a Q&A. Oh, someone says, amen, France had Napoleon before durable democracy, but Mina has to get to democracy immediately. not a question, but could demand a response if you'd like.
Thank you so much.
I will say, like, if people are feeling shy, I have a question that actually came up for me while watching you all talk, which is really about like there's I think, and you know, again, as somebody who's like, oh, not, you know, like I'm not in the literature the way you are. I'm not studying this, obviously the way you are. So to me, this is like a popular perception and not a like scholarly perception of like conflict as a very discrete phenomenon, like coming from the US. Like we have these handful of wars, we won them. There's a good guy and a bad guy. You know, they last a few years, you know. I don't remember how long our longest war even was, but yeah, okay, so yeah, so it's like the time scale for what Americans often see as a conflict is just very small. And, you know, as we're maybe approaching another civil war on issues that never really went away from the first civil war, I can't help but wonder if we're completely wrong. So all of you at some point had brought up something about like perpetual conflict, you know, uprisings that are on issues that aren't resolved, like a rise and not fall in authoritarian regimes since we've like started studying them. And you know, like, do you want to speak to that or have any notes for Americans who are just learning that conflict isn't what we thought it was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can very briefly, I mean, I think that you're exactly right. I mean, I think in the US, public discourse and in many cases scholarly research, but I think, yeah, public discourse is accustomed to approaching war and conflict as episodic and as an aberration that, you know, is a departure from what otherwise should be a, you know, a peaceful status quo. And I think, yeah, to some degree that was always an illusion, but you know, the type and scale and frequency of wars and massacres and uprisings and conflict that we're seeing now, and the types of fractures we're seeing in, you know, institutions that we may have thought were rock solid, like after Donald Trump's first election, you know, they're challenging us to think differently. Um, and you know, I think that normal science of approaching these things, and that's not to say that we can't study, you know, specific episodes of you know, of history or of conflict. Of course we can. But in general, I think it may be more productive, or at least sometimes, to challenge ourselves to switch the lens and see these as you know, upsurges in what's otherwise an underlying condition of growing disorder. And I think that that can be a, you know, productive lens to look through.
Go ahead, Laura, if you'd like to
Also,
speak. I can go last.
I was also going to add real quick, if that's okay, because this is also thinking on what you were talking about, you know, like the Egyptian revolution in 2011 and some of these others. I mean, what that taught a lot of us, and me too, you know, back when I was a plucky Occupy organizer that year, was, you know, just how quickly things can escalate and how quickly systems that seem to be rock solid can come apart in the face of mass uprisings. That can happen extremely rapidly. And that's an example of that for mobilizations. That can also happen for people in terms of civil wars, you know, like people who are living a life that they, you know, perceived as normal, and the next thing you know, it's radically different because the civil war has escalated or your country's caught between, you know, whatever other forces. So yeah, just adding that in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And look, it's interesting. I mean, I started my presentation with saying that in 2022 there were 55 active state-based conflicts across the world. So I find it puzzling, actually, like the fact that depending on where we live in the world, we still tend to think of civil wars as episodic and, you know, and short, when in reality, at least the reality that I grew up in living in Colombia, was like for the entirety of my life, I had been at war, right? And something that was really, really puzzling is like, why does it seem that for some societies, there's no way out? Now, I think that the study of civil war generally could benefit a lot from more sociologists, hopefully, in getting engaged and involving in the research, because I think there's so much that we can learn from actually the vast amount of work that exists in United States intergroup relations, and actually in how systems of oppression and discrimination become perpetuated over time. And even though we don't see what happens in the United States, and we shouldn't see it as a state of civil war, because it is not. Well, there are similarities in terms of how certain systems of oppression also kind of like get put in place in places with civil war. And of course, there are differences for why there's so much violence in those places, and we don't see it in the same light or at the same scale in others. But it also helps us to understand that there's nothing episodic about this, right? If anything, it's really productive to start thinking about them, about like, how do they keep perpetuating? What is it that explains the cycle? What is it that sustains kind of like these processes of discrimination, of oppression of different minority groups across the world? So yeah, the study of civil war seems like very minor in sociology, but I do think that there's so much that the discipline generally has to offer, and can become a lot more vocal and kind of like engaging conversations that happen predominantly in political science or in other fields. And I feel like we could really, really bring a new light into how we come to understand this. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. That's what I was thinking too, Laura. I will just comment also that I'm thinking about the importance of what a military does when a government decides to become more repressive, crack down on its people, give them illegal orders, something along those lines is key to what's going to be happening in the United States moving forward, key to what's going to be happening in Ukraine. And I found it was really key to what was happening in Vietnam as a result of just the mass disorder that that war created within the U.S. military, and particularly in the Army. Essentially, Nixon canceled the draft. And for these last 50 years, we have seen the two longest American wars ever, because we have an increasing separation between society and the state. We have what's called the all-volunteer force, which is draft through economic means, right? Through need, through you need to go to college, right? You need to have a job instead of a draft. And I think about this a lot because I teach my students about the importance of resistance to injustice at a time where, like, they were my age when we were invading Afghanistan. I knew nothing about Afghanistan. All I knew was that we'd all been sort of prepped with this patriotic sort of propaganda for the Gulf War in 1990 when I was a kid. But moving forward, none of my brothers, my friends, my colleagues, nobody was impacted by this war because of my privilege and because of our collective privilege. And a lot of Vietnam veterans are very proud that they resisted the Vietnam War, but they regret that wars have been able to become longer for certain perpetuating powers, because society, for the most part, unless they have a personal familial tie to the military as a job, are essentially insulated from a lot of the costs of those wars. Yet we know that violence always comes home to roost at some point. Whether states are successful in repression or control is only temporary, just as resistance comes in waves, right? So it's just speaking to your point about the fact that conflict seems episodic. Like, it is amazing to me that you see people waving in this very conservative part of Indiana a Ukrainian flag above the American flag. But if somebody waves a Puerto Rico or Mexican flag above the American flag, they're literally accused of being traitors and that they should go home. So again, the geopolitics that's like infiltrating are that association of like good guys, bad guys, as you were saying, or Laura is saying, you know, victimhood, offending group, or even what violence is and when it's legitimate is pretty incredible. And so, yeah, there's a lot to think about, but I do think we need to think about how people within the state are going to be reacting to future events, not just how people on the street are going to be reacting, because without those alliances, the people who are in power can do a lot of harm.
Okay, this has been really amazing, and I am like remiss to stop, but I want to respect the stop point for our panelists and also for the audience. But I do encourage those of you who had unanswered questions, like, first of all, please go read the panelists' work. And also, I think all of you are on social media, so that might be a good place to connect. I don't want to like tell people just go email them. It's fine, you know, but like, I don't know if you know them or, you know, yeah, maybe reach out by email. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us, and look out for announcements for our next panel, which will be in the fall. You all get a summer break. So yeah, take care, and I'm gonna stop the recording.
Great. Thanks to you all for organizing. You did an awesome job. I didn't ask any questions because I had a kid in the background, but thank you, everybody.
Great to see you.